So, hi everyone, and welcome to episode 29 of Now and Men, a podcast about men, masculinities, and gender equality. I'm Sandy Ruxton, and I'm here with Stephen Burrell.
Hi Sandy, hi everybody. Yes, for today's episode we're looking at men's engagement with veganism, and we have with us Dr. Kadri Aavik, who's an Associate Professor of Gender Studies in the School of Governance, Law and Society at Tallinn University in Estonia.
Yes, Kadri has conducted a really interesting range of research on gender and gender inequalities, and also on critical animal studies, including human-animal relations, animal advocacy, and vegan movements, and ecofeminism. She's got a new book out, which has just been published by Palgrave Macmillan, and it's called Contesting Anthropocentric Masculinities Through Veganism, Lived Experiences of Vegan Men. And we'll be talking to her about this today.
Yeah, and Kadri's also the editor, or one of the editors, of another new book which is coming out called The Routledge Handbook of Men, Masculinities and Organisations. So that's going to be published later on this year, and Sandy and I also have a chapter in that. So, we might talk about that as well in a future episode. Hi Kadri, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi Sandy and hi Stephen, and thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to talking to you about vegan men and masculinities.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for coming on the show. So perhaps to start off with, perhaps for people who might not be familiar with this topic or have an understanding of the gender dynamics of it, could you say a little bit about why is it that food and eating can be seen as being kind of gendered issues, and what are some of the ways in which they are kind of linked to masculinity in particular?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So there are actually very important links between food, eating, and gender, and somewhat different foods are considered appropriate for different genders, and this also stems from different cultural ideas about what our bodies should look like and what they should do. And as we have all observed, certain foods are culturally more associated with masculinity. That's particularly meat, and also especially certain kinds of meat, like for instance beef. And meat is really equated still with protein, and still in kind of mainstream knowledge, animal protein is considered the best way to maintain and gain physical strength and muscle, and so particularly men are encouraged to consume meat. So definitely eating meat still remains a powerful norm for many men through which to do masculinity. And then when we talk about women, and so at the same time dieting and sort of more lean foods are mainly targeted at women. When we think of different kinds of animal products like dairy and cheese, among those products, they are more associated with femininity and considered appropriate foods for women. There's one interesting thing also to mention, that while we have those very powerful links between eating meat and masculinity, for instance, there are some vegan men, like vegan bodybuilders. It's kind of a recent phenomenon, but they are active on social media, for instance, so they kind of challenge this link, and they are vegan, but they are sort of muscular. But at the same time, they do not challenge these links between masculinity and physical strength and muscle. So they kind of leave that intact. So I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, so I think one of the fascinating things about your research, which I'm sure we'll explore more, is how men engage in different ways with veganism and masculinity. I mean, perhaps just as we're starting, could you perhaps just briefly say, like, what is veganism? To somebody who's still quite new to that as a topic, as an issue, as a way of being, like, could you just say, like, how we might try and define it?
Yes, thank you for that question. And maybe it's not so straightforward even, because there are so different definitions in a way. So maybe one of the most well-known kind of definitions comes from the UK Vegan Society, and they kind of talked about veganism as a way to minimize harm to other animals, non-human animals. So it doesn't, the minimize harm is kind of important wording, because obviously we can't, by just being alive and doing things in our everyday lives, we can't always stop like all harm, but it's about like doing whatever we can, I would say, in our capacity to minimize it. But there are like different and maybe a bit competing definitions, and maybe one of the most popular ones is, veganism is a diet. it's something like just what we eat, and this kind of like neglects these kind of power relations between humans and animals, and very much focuses on human beings. Yeah, so there are somewhat different definitions, and yeah, in my book, in my work, I definitely consider those power relations, and think of veganism as this kind of broader philosophy, a set of values really to minimize harm, and I guess not only to animals but also other human beings. So maybe that's important.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I suppose there's a range of reasons in which somebody might want to become vegan, I guess, isn't there? Like, that could include ethical reasons, environmental reasons, wanting to care for animals, for health reasons as well. Yeah, and so you've done some really interesting research with men who are vegan about their kind of experiences, which is what your book is about. So yeah, could you just tell us briefly, what the research you've done involved, and what the kind of main motivations were among the men that you interviewed about, why they became vegan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so basically, for this research, I spoke to 61 vegan men based in Northern Europe, and specifically in Estonia and in Finland. But actually, previously, most research on vegans, it has been done in kind of Anglo-American contexts, and so it was interesting to explore another context. And I'm Estonian myself, and so I've been working in Finland, so I was familiar with that context. But yeah, so it's based on it is interviews in which I spoke to these men about what it means for them to be vegan, to become vegan, different aspects of veganism in their lives. So very kind of a broad range of topics. But yeah, if you ask about these motivations, so basically, as you maybe know, the main motivations for vegans have to do with three sets of reasons. So becoming vegan for animals, for environment, and for your own health, basically. And these men actually, there were these reasons were represented definitely. When I spoke to them at the time of the interviews, the most common reason was they had become vegan for other animals, but also these other reasons were somewhat important. And it was also interesting to see like how someone could start from maybe purely or mainly health related reasons, but then as they had been vegan for a while, their kind of knowledge about veganism expanded as they were looking for more information, and then they made links and learned about the devastating impact of animal farming and eating animals on the climate, for instance. And that is being increasingly talked about too in mainstream media. And also the health kind of benefits. And then very many actually said that they have several reasons why they are currently vegan, and maybe the main one, animals for many, but the environmental and health reasons also kind of important. These were very represented there.
And did you see was masculinity in your view, like, was that a big factor in their motivations? Was it, for example, was there a lot of arguments being made about what the scientific rational justifications, or actually were their motivations more actually challenging some of these dominant ideas about masculinity, that men shouldn't care for other living things, and that actually they were questioning that, perhaps?
This is also really interesting, and I covered that aspect a little bit. For them, basically, this kind of, for many men, this care actually about these animals and even like emotions that they felt in relation to the animals, it was really important. But when I talked to them about how they communicate veganism to others, particularly to men and non-vegan men, they kind of said that, sensing how other people see them, and they see like there are these cultural ideas about men they shouldn't be seen as so emotional, then they were wary of emphasizing this care and emotionality, but they did kind of use also the rational argumentation and the kind of facts about climate impact and things. So and some of them actually saw that as a problem, and they were really cognizant of this, that maybe we are reproducing those ideas about masculinity that are problematic. So that was a very interesting aspect. There was this clear distinction between the kind of what they themselves personally felt and believed in, and how they represented veganism.
As you're talking, Kadri, you're making me wonder about your own experience of veganism, if I can ask you about that. I mean, when did you actually become vegan, and has your relationship with veganism changed over time?
Yes, absolutely. So I have been vegan for 18 years. I became vegan in 2005, and I did it in Estonia, where veganism was completely unknown at the time. And in one grocery store, there was one kind of soy milk, and yeah, it was really difficult, but also I guess fun, you know. And I started in a way you could say that for maybe health related reasons, but soon the main motivation was became animal rights, and then I learned about the environmental links later. And so basically, I now that I'm working as an academic, and this is a bit more recent that I have incorporated studying vegans and veganism into my research topics, and so there's that personal values and links, and I think also it's such an interesting and rich area to study. So I kind of definitely my values influenced this work, and I think the fact that my own veganism really influenced, shaped my study and interviewing these vegan men, because I think they were more open, discussing certain aspects of veganism with me as another vegan. For instance, kind of some uncomfortable situations, interactions with non-vegans. It's easier to discuss with another vegan, perhaps, So I think that was important.
And did you start off being vegetarian and then move to being vegan? Is that a track that people quite often follow?
Yes, I did actually. So I became vegetarian first, and I was for 7 years vegetarian. And actually, I did not know of veganism really, and didn't make those links. And I was really believing that I'm not harming animals while I was actually eating dairy products. And that's a common link. And for the men in the study, there was also that path that at least some of them took, that they were first vegetarian and then became vegan. Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier the connections between veganism and eating meat being kind of culturally identified as a masculine practice. Do you want to say a bit more about that? Why is that? Where does that come from?
I think it has to do also, maybe there's power relations that, the hierarchies that we have, us as human beings, and men sort of at the top of social hierarchy, and then we humans at the top of, hierarchy of beings in a way. Of course, the hierarchies are being challenged right now, but so maybe it relates to this kind of idea of patriarchy too, that, historically we have observed like patterns of men's ownership of women and non-human animals, and unfortunately animals continue to be still owned, in the capitalist system. And even now, those with a greater number of animals, they are able to accumulate more wealth and on relying and exploiting their animals' reproductive capacities, pretty much. And so I think it has to do with these hierarchies as well. And as I said, I think with these ideas that you really need these animal products to sustain yourself and to gain muscle. And of course, muscle is more associated with men and masculinity. So it's often considered unthinkable. How can you, particularly as a man, not consume animals?
Yeah, and you've also mentioned health quite a bit already, but is it true that men's diets, generally speaking, I'm generalizing horribly here, tend to be less healthy than women's diets? Is that right?
Yes, that's what has been found in statistical and quantitative research. So I also, for my book, I quoted some of that research, but that's true that overall, men's meat consumption is higher than that of women, and that causes all sorts of health problems as well. And yes, the diets tend to be unhealthier.
So that is a reason for pushing plant-based diets more towards men, isn't it?
Definitely, and so in another paper, I actually looked at this with a colleague. I know, basically based on the same interviews with these Finnish and Estonian vegan men, like how they perceive their own health behavior and how it has changed. And in fact, we found that becoming vegan for men it kind of transformed. There was a transformation towards more like healthier masculinity, maybe better health behavior. And it's interesting that actually among these men that I interviewed, there are several who they call themselves junk food vegans. So they really want to distance themselves from this healthy eating, because in the vegan community, this kind of health food veganism is sometimes considered as very selfish and egoistic and all about the humans, and but we should be vegan for the animals. So there were men who also distanced themselves from this healthy eating. But while they were doing so, in fact, when they became vegan, they learned a lot about food and nutrition, and also, as a vegan, you need to make sure you have, adequate levels of vitamin B12 or something. And then they learned about this, and they actually learned, cooking, and there were tendencies towards, eating healthier, I would say.
It's so interesting, yeah. I mean, because I suppose as well, I think you mentioned at the beginning, like, typically men tend to be less involved in household cooking, right, compared to women. I mean, do you have any explanations for why that is? Like, why, is that because cooking is seen as being quite a feminized activity? And if so, is that something which is changing? And can veganism help to shift and challenge some of these perceptions in your view?
Yeah, definitely. So cooking in the household is a very feminized activity and definitely undervalued. And of course, when we think of cooking more broadly, different kinds of cooking in different settings. For instance, when you think of the top chefs who own restaurants, and Gordon Ramsay and people like that, so they tend to be these men who are very high earning and it's very prestigious, But when you think of who cooks in canteens and school kitchens, of course these are low paid women. So it's very interesting that way. But definitely the household cooking, men have historically been less involved in that activity, that everyday feeding of the family in particular. And in my research, it was quite a minor aspect that I studied, and I think it should be studied more. But as I noted, there was this increased interest in food and cooking in the men, that emerged from the interviews, and also taking up more home cooking was visible as well. But I think there's a big difference between sometimes cooking some interesting plant-based meals and experimenting with food versus like everyday feeding of the family, which I think is still very feminized. And so I'm not sure, and I can't say anything profound about this, whether and to what extent the men's veganism is transformative in that aspect. So I think it should be studied more, but I think there's some potential.
Actually, I wonder as well, like, do you think that could be a factor which does because women are much more likely to be vegans and vegetarians, aren't they, than men? I think, is it a third? I think in your book, did you say it's about a third of, in most countries, of vegans are men? And I mean, do you think that is one factor, that it's just, and I would actually consider myself in this, people just don't quite know, like, how they could cook, like, good, nice vegan food. Like, we've all got some recipes which we use on a day-to-day basis and just don't quite know, like, a good vegan recipes, and perhaps men in particular might not feel very confident about that. Like, I mean, is that a factor at all, do you think? Or?
Yes, definitely. And some of the men I spoke to, they admitted that their previous knowledge of cooking and food and nutrition was really inadequate. They didn't know, they hadn't been taught. And they kind of felt that with veganism, they were in a way forced to learn this in a way. Particularly if you live alone and you have to suddenly you have to, or you don't have to, you choose to replace some key ingredients that you cook with in a way, and you learn to do it in new ways. You learn about those ingredients, you learn about what makes you full and what makes you feel good. So it's a process of learning that they engaged in. But there was one interesting aspect that in a way maintains those gendered hierarchies here, that when the men spoke about kind of family gatherings that they now attend as a vegan, then very typical, it was mentioned that, my mother has learned how to cook vegan food, the figure of the mother still as one responsible for cooking in the family meals, basically. So when they maybe went to visit the family, it was their mother who cooked those meals. And then one of those indications of like how accepting your family members are of your veganism is, whether and to what extent your family, or particularly your mother, learns to cook these foods for the men. So that was kind of interesting, and maybe we can see that those conservative this kind of division of labor is still maintained in a way.
Yeah, that's actually something Sandy and I were talking about before we started recording, about like how difficult it can be for people to kind of bring these issues up, like in the family context, right? Like the discomfort around actually, like saying that actually you are vegan or vegetarian, and that actually kind of it requires potentially some change in the people around you, doesn't it? If you're all eating together, and that can make you feel guilty, or it can make them feel guilty, and those can be difficult dynamics to juggle, can't they? I guess, yeah.
Yes, very much so. And I have a chapter in the book about these interactions, that vegan men have with their sort of birth families and friends. And if we talk about, barriers to veganism for men and maybe for others, and this was identified as one of the main ones that the kind of interactions, the difficult and uncomfortable interactions with others, with non-vegans, was really like a difficult experience, and this was considered much more difficult to manage than actually issues around actual food and eating and these material aspects, but these others, which shows that demonstrates how veganism is really, you negotiate it, and in everyday settings it's very relational, and you have to negotiate, renegotiate, and these kinds of like explaining to people a lot, and very repeatedly, and people usually ask the same things, and you become a bit frustrated, and there's also some of those comments that you get are somehow unkind. Not everything is very kind. So responding to that and developing kind of strategies was quite difficult. And previous research actually has shown that also for other vegans, women and other vegans, this has also been considered like one of the barriers. So definitely it's not unique to men only.
Yeah. Well, and it shows food is such a social thing, isn't it? As you said, it's not a simple case of what you choose to eat that day or something like that, but it's so shaped by our social lives. I was wondering if we could go back to what you were saying about kind of patriarchy as well, because I find that very interesting, and I think there's some really valuable insights, isn't there, which have been provided by kind of feminists and kind of eco-feminist theorists. Like I recently read, I was encouraged by a friend and colleague, Dr. Cassie Peterson, to read a book, by the book The Sexual Politics of Meat, which I know is which has been very influential, hasn't it, for a long time in this area, about thinking about the connections between like sexism and misogyny and how we treat animals, and as you were saying, kind of hierarchies, and how we objectify, women, and how we objectify animals as a way of legitimizing kind of mistreatment and violence. Really, I mean, like, do you want to say any more about that? Like, what are the connections between patriarchy and how we as humans kind of relate to other animals?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, Carol Adams's work has been really influential in like critical animal studies and feminist animal studies, like basically demonstrating those links of exploitation of women and animals, and kind of animals. So what she has talked about is kind of their reproductive capacities are exploited. You could think that their eggs and milk that are actually for their offspring, then we humans take them and use them. We take them away from them, and she has basically drawn some parallels between. Some animals are even sexualized, and drawn parallels between the sexualization of women and animals in popular culture. Some images of chicken with a bra or something, and really there's more of that. So and I talked about this kind of the role of men in this, and also as kind of owning animals. And when we think about basically the meat industry, which is vast, and it's hugely profit making, the global meat industry, then who are basically the owners and managers of those industries? They tend to be mostly privileged Western white men who really are the owners and managers of the biggest meat producers on the planet, and they basically earn billions of dollars and euros of money. So, and also, of course, men are represented as owners, as members of governments who are regulating those industries. So, men have a really big role on the sort of macro scale as well in this process of how how animals are still owned and represented.
Yeah. And presumably workers in the industry as well are predominantly men.
Absolutely.
And that can't be a very nice job a lot of the time.
Actually, that's a good point that you bring up, because work in slaughterhouses is known to be one of the most dangerous and damaging kinds of work, and damaging physically and mentally, in terms of there are like a lot of injuries there, and those workers tend to be very marginalized in different countries. There's a lot of research, for instance, in the US, where those workers are basically people who are migrants, and they are people of color and marginalized in different ways. And so there's also environmental racism that is talked about in the context of animal farming, how there are these big animal farms, and they are very polluting, and then who lives near those farms are very poor people and marginalized people of color, maybe. So it's all really connected, the kind of exploitation of animals and also people. So they're really important links here.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier the links between masculinity, veganism, and climate change. I wondered if you wanted to say a bit more about that. And I'm assuming you think that veganism is part of a solution to the climate change crisis and ecological crisis that we face. Is that right?
Definitely. This is what I argue in my book, and I think it could be one of the ways forward. I don't claim that it's the only one, but I think that encouraging veganism and kind of vegan masculinity is a very promising way forward. So as I think mentioned earlier, that men consume more meat globally than women, and their ecological footprint then is higher. And it's also known that consuming animals is one of the among the most important drivers of climate change. And not only climate change, but also different kinds of environmental damage. So definitely there's a big link here. And I think that in this context where we are in, I think there are these multiple crises that are, crisis of sustainability, crisis of inequalities, so different crises. And I think we see maybe already now a little bit, but that we might see more of kind of a transformation of masculinity in this context, because we need to move away from these unsustainable ideals and practices of masculinity, particularly, given men's really important role in meat consumption and owning these industries. So I think there should be some change, and I'm thinking that we could encourage that kind of change. And I'm not saying that veganism is the solution to all kinds of issues related to masculinity. There are definitely some problematic aspects, like some men who not necessarily, demonstrating care towards others. You can be vegan or have at least be on a plant-based diet in a way that you are concentrated mainly or only on your own health. So it can be a sort of like a project of self-improvement, self-enhancement that really aligns with some neoliberal ideals, individualism. So there's different ways of being a vegan, and yeah.
I guess what you've been talking about is the influence of what you term, I think, anthropocentric masculinities. Is that right? And is that what you mean by anthropocentric masculinities? That it's kind of, defined by a belief in sort of human superiority, if you like, and male superiority over animals in
Yeah,
particular. Is that
basically,
what's meant by that?
yeah. Yeah, that's what I mean by that, that it's very human-centered, and now there's a need to move away from that and to kind of towards post-anthropocentric
Yeah.
ideals that consider the needs of other living beings, other species, also the environment. So the lot of problems with just human-centered values and practices, and I think we need to move away from those.
And in a way, then, the climate crisis, an ecological crisis, you could see as presenting some opportunities for positive change, at the same time as having to deal with the hugely damaging aspects.
Yes, absolutely. So I see it as a point of that crisis actually does have some kind of opportunities. There are opportunities for really rethinking our unsustainable ways of living and being and coexisting with other species, other living beings. So it's just we hope that it doesn't happen too late, we would need to, or already would have needed to make a profound change in our energy consumption and the kind of pollutants and greenhouse gases that we are emitting. So it's sort of now is the point that we really need to do this, obviously.
One thing I was wondering about as well, I mean, you've kind of mentioned a few of them already, but could you perhaps say a little bit more about, what perhaps you've come across in your research in terms of what some of the big barriers are that, that people in general, but perhaps especially men face in terms of, trying to become vegan? Like, what are some of the main obstacles they've encountered in doing that?
Yes, so I was a bit probably surprised. I thought that kind of access to vegan food maybe would be a bigger obstacle, but it wasn't. And there were men who were really looking for those specialty vegan products and things like that. But actually, they are quite accessible, available in the context that I studied, Estonia and Finland. In a way, Estonia and Finland currently are like any other Western country in terms of the availability of these products and also vegan eateries and things. So that these material aspects were manageable really well. Most of these men lived also in kind of urban areas, and they were very privileged men, I should say that. So this wasn't a big thing, but I think, as I mentioned too, this kind of social interactions were really difficult and to manage them. And it was interesting too how having been vegan for a while, these men developed different strategies of how to manage those things. And first there would be a lot frustration and maybe even anger at these repeated questions, and particularly when they really were confronted with this reality. They had learned about what the animal industry is and what it does, and then there were all these emotions, and they felt, how come that people around me do not share this, do not know about this, or why don't they act? And there was this. It was difficult to manage those initial feelings. But after a few years, I guess, or depending on the person, but it took some time, and then they basically took a more maybe calm approach in a way, and some even maybe said, that it's more rational to just try to calmly persuade people and talk to them, and it's no use, getting angry. And so basically, they were trying to, show and display empathy towards the non-vegans, and they were thinking, well, once I used to eat meat and animal products, and so let me try to see what matters to them, and also it was very contextual. They were thinking what arguments would resonate with that person that I talked to. So maybe if there was a vegan man who maybe was vegan for animals, but then they saw that for the person they were talking to, health aspects mattered the most, and they would talk about that maybe. So it very much adjusted to the person they spoke to. So they really these interactions were the most difficult, but I would say they developed strategies over the years, over some time, how to manage those interactions. But maybe I should also say here about the masculinity aspect, because that is considered often, the huge barrier for men to become vegan, because veganism is feminized, and there are studies still indicate that men who eat meat are considered more masculine and all that. So this was really interesting because these men they saw this as a barrier to other men, but not really so much to themselves. And in a way, you can think, well, it makes sense because they have overcome that barrier. Like for them personally, they didn't see a conflict between their veganism and masculinity. You know, for them it was compatible, but they were worried about other men, and they, in a way, they constructed themselves as different and as always having been in some ways different from others. And in a way, that kind of identity helped them to adopt veganism and to remain vegan. For instance, the ways that they were different, they about for some men, it was a particularly distinct group of Finnish men who had kind of leftist politics, and they had these values like gender equality. And so veganism was kind of for them compatible with these earlier values, pacifism as well. And they said like, well, I basically I was always different. I had these other values, and people already considered me a little bit strange, different from others. So to adopt veganism for me was maybe a logical step, or people were not shocked in a way. So in a way, they kind of incorporated this veganism into their identities in a quite a successful way, I would say. So that was quite interesting.
Really interesting, yeah. Because you do see there is quite a lot of kind of mocking, isn't there, and maybe bullying and or denigration of vegan or vegetarian men as not being real men, like this whole idea of being a soy boy. Like, you know, here in the UK, like a politician, Suella Braverman, talked about like the tofu eating wokerati. So yeah, these ideas are quite, yeah, they are out there, aren't they?
I wanted to ask you a little bit about cultural context as well. I mean, you mentioned, you know, your research was conducted in Estonia and Finland, and presumably there are, you know, significant differences between these societies in terms of, you know, history and culture, their approaches to gender equality and so on. I mean, I heard a program on the radio recently here which talked about obesity in Finland and how there'd been a sort of state approach to really try and deal with that from, I think it might have been about the 1980s onwards, you know, and getting people to eat less meat and more berries and so on and so forth. So that there are different traditions and cultures and histories that are relevant here. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yes, sure. And I think it's very interesting to study these contexts that are normally or typically not studied in the context of veganism. And in fact, as I said, you know, if you think about the availability of products and you go to the shop and in major cities in Finland and Estonia, you have all these products available. It looks like any Western country. And definitely it's very important, like what vegans we're talking about. And as I mentioned, these men are very privileged in my study. And I kind of emphasize that. So I can't really generalize this to like all vegan men, but definitely they had access to these products as Western middle class consumers pretty much. But I think maybe one thing, the climate is cold, as you know, in Estonia and Finland. And so one obstacle that the men might face, that people would ask, so how, you know, it's so cold, you have to eat meat. You know, that's a thing. But so maybe that's a specific thing to that area. But if we speak about kind of some cultural and institutional differences between Estonia and Finland, so definitely there are some significant ones that shape vegan identities and practices. And so Estonia is a post-Soviet country, and it got its re-independence in 1991. And then veganism actually, of course, became available much, much later in Estonia than in Finland and in many countries that were, you know, not occupied by this regime. And also in Estonia, we really didn't have those, you know, for a long time, those other progressive social movements that would maybe align with veganism or support it in a way. And Finland, of course, had them, like the feminist movement, for instance. And when you think of kind of some institutional resistance, which I've written about, institutional resistance to veganism, so in Estonia you have a lot more of that than in Finland. For instance, in Estonia, the national nutrition recommendations or the dietary guidelines, so far they do not support veganism, and they are even against it. And they are like, you know, depict veganism as dangerous to people. So of course that impacts the way that people whether they take up veganism. And also medical doctors in Estonia are not so well informed about veganism. But I would say about and gender equality is another issue, that Finland has overall higher levels of gender equality, and that means also that more alternative ways of doing masculinity are supported culturally. And that means that it is in a way easier for men to become vegan, at least for the privileged men, because veganism is a sort of alternative practice for men, and so to take that up is easier for men than in a more kind of traditional context in terms of gender relations. And this is important because the context, the macro kind of institutional cultural context that we are in shape our ways of our everyday practices, including veganism.
And is there a criticism made that veganism is something for, white, privileged, Western people generally, and, look at developing countries and, the suffering there and the symbiotic relationships with animals that some people have in developing countries, are there criticisms around that as well?
Yes, definitely. So yeah, there's a kind of some debates about that, particularly in the US, and where veganism is accused to be or said to be a very white elitist practice and available to white people who are so many vegans of color have said that they do not really these white perspectives do not understand maybe the barriers that more marginalized people face in adopting veganism. And definitely there have been very problematic assumptions that veganism is only for the animals and we shouldn't even bring issues of race here, for instance. And of course this is really problematic, and obviously we have to consider race here because there are links between how animals have been represented and exploited, as well as how marginalized people of color have been exploited and represented. So we have to take this critique seriously. But then again, there are these really, I've been really inspired by some indigenous scholars, for instance, who actually take veganism seriously and say that, it is compatible with our worldviews. I don't want to generalize. Of course, there are very different indigenous traditions in different places. But when you think of, how meat and dairy products are everywhere, and they are now also being consumed a lot and increasingly in societies where they didn't used to be consumed so much, like in China and in many other places. And we can think how in a lot of contexts colonization involved introducing cattle and these animals that people kept into these places that actually destroyed a lot of the landscapes, the livelihoods of local indigenous people. So in a way that has been called also a form of colonialism, and this colonizing the diet is kind of what some scholars of color, indigenous scholars, have noted, how our diets have been colonized, and in order to decolonize them we should think of ditching animal products and maybe thinking of what are some local plant-based foods. So that's a way to kind of resist colonialism and these legacies and also these corporations that continue to exploit us in a way. So I think, these approaches are very interesting and inspiring.
Yeah, and I think, even here in the UK, I don't think we used to eat as much meat or dairy as we do now. Actually, it's quite a recent phenomenon to consume it in the amounts that we do now. But one thing I was thinking about as well, because I lived in Finland for a while, and one thing which was amazing there was, at the university and at schools, and in the workplace, I think as well, you would have there would be canteens with, and maybe you have this in Estonia as well, I don't know, but canteens with really good quality, cheap lunches which everybody could have, and it's quite a nice social thing, and there would always be a good vegetarian or vegan option there as well. So I suppose that shows, doesn't it, that actually this isn't just about individual responsibility, this is about our institutions and organizations structurally embracing veganism and vegetarianism. I mean, do you want to say anything about that how is this not just an individual problem, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's such a good point that you're making here. Indeed, in Finland, I have lived there myself, and I've always I loved really the University of Helsinki
Yeah.
canteen, where for quite a cheap price you could get a really good filling
Yeah.
vegan meal.
Yeah.
And in Estonia, unfortunately, yeah, that's one of the issues when you think of the difference is that there is not that institutional support, and students actually pay a lot for their meals, and they do not get still. Nutritious vegan meal. So that is a huge problem. And so institutions have a fundamental role in shaping our food practices and other ways of life. And actually, one example that is interesting in this context. So in Estonia and Finland, and this relates to masculinity, there's a compulsory military service for men. So they have to go there pretty much. And among the research participants of mine, there was this distinct group of Finnish men that I mentioned with these pacifist lefty kind of values that they basically either they were conscientious objectors, or they chose this alternative service that you can choose in a way that you do some kind of usually kind of feminized social work or care work, which is also interesting from the perspective of masculinity. But those who did go to the army, you have the option of getting in Finland nutritious plant-based meals there. So this is what the institution provides, and in Estonia, they're not providing this really. So as a vegan man, it's very very difficult for you. So this a way of how institutions. Obviously, this doesn't make the Finnish army in any way like a good institution or a vegan institution, because they just provide plant-based meals. But obviously, the army has got its other huge problems as an institution. But yeah.
Talking about institutions, you'll be amused that I'm talking from Oxford in the UK, and our local council here, which is a Labour-controlled council, has tried to introduce vegan meals for all its meetings, and there's been a huge fight about this. And people have been walking out and going to the pub and all kinds of, and actually, I think that's happening in other councils around the country as well. So your point about institutions is well made, but it's also quite contested, isn't it?
It is, yes. But actually, Helsinki, if I'm not mistaken, the city of Helsinki has a rule now that all the events that are organized by the municipality must have plant-based meals only, if I'm not mistaken. And this is a big step, in fact, that institutions can take. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's also something for NGOs to think about as well, isn't it? I mean, Stephen and I are part of Men Engage Alliance, and they have meetings, and we have discussed whether at least a core part of those meetings, if food is involved, should actually be vegan. It hasn't always been the case in the past, and actually probably it should be.
Well, it's good that there are discussions about this, and maybe it will
No,
change.
definitely. But I wanted to ask you also about not just the relationship between institutions and veganism, but also about veganism and activism too. So I think in a way you've said something about veganism being an individual practice, but it's also a basis for sort of collective action as well, isn't it? So and individuals may sit in a different place in relation to how they see themselves on that continuum. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, and this is interesting. I guess veganism, whether it is called activism, it's a bit contested, because usually it's also depending on what we view as activism in a way, and sometimes we think of just that there's a formal organization and these people come together and do some actions. But veganism, as you note, that people are sort of doing something individually, but in a way it's been according to some of the definitions, it's called a lifestyle activism. There's such a term, but for me, I really think it is a form of activism, and I guess my idea of activism is quite broad. Of course, I wouldn't want to include everything under the umbrella of activism, but I think there's an important concept called everyday activism, which I like, and it's sort of basically what to do on your material practices as well on an everyday level. And I think veganism fits with that definition. So definitely, even if you maybe are not participating in, demonstrations and do these more traditional things that are associated with activism and social movements, you still do really significant material things, and you do not consume these animal products, and so that is significant in itself, I think.
I was actually thinking about the kind of overlaps with like pro-feminist activism, which is, I suppose, very much also about kind of everyday activism, isn't it? And but also can perhaps be quite isolating, because I guess there aren't that many pro-feminist men out there, so perhaps it can feel quite lonely at times. And so the importance, even if it is quite everyday activism that you're doing, of connecting with other people, feeling part of a community. The one thing I just wanted to ask about, which you've kind of pointed to already, but like, what do you think, or what has your research shown to be some of the impacts that veganism has on men's relationships, with them, their relationships with themselves, like their own health and well-being, but also with other people, or other living things in their lives, right? Does it have an impact on those relationships? Like, does it lead to a greater embrace of care, for example, in your experience?
Yeah, that's a very important question that I touched upon in my book, and I did argue that becoming vegan encourages greater care for others as well as self-care. And in a way that, yes, the men spoke about definitely this increasing sense of care towards animals that they developed in the process of becoming vegan, but also like more consideration of others. And actually there's that notion of caring masculinity by Carla Elliott and some others who use that. So I think it aligns well with that. But I think it's really, we must be also careful in drawing some profound conclusions based on this. Because, as I said, if you are vegan maybe only for health reasons and you practice this self-care, it can be very individualistic and maybe not like there's not so much care for others. It's directed towards the self. And so I think that for care to be meaningful, it must be primarily other directed and produce some kind of positive change. But then this, on the other hand, it was encouraging to see how these men in kind of interpersonal relationships, they practice more care and empathy, like in trying to understand the non-vegan's position, with friends and family members, and really like there was this consideration of others, how they feel, and it was interesting how there were some men who spoke about not wanting them to feel uncomfortable, because often when a vegan simply walks into the room or says they're vegan, not anything else, then people often feel uncomfortable. So some of the men were really conscious of this and tried to mitigate this somehow and think of how they can make others comfortable. So I think it was a sort of interesting form of care. But yeah, I think the findings are a little bit mixed here, but I think there's potential for greater care here.
Thanks. I liked your phrase in everyday activism as well. I guess it's a kind of combination of things, isn't it, really? But I don't know about you, but we've done an hour, and I'm kind of thinking I need to go and have some food.
Sure. Peckish.
Have a tea.
Yes.
So I just, I would just say thank you so much for joining us for this episode today. It's been really fascinating to hear you talk about your book and all these issues that you're working on.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really a pleasure to talk to you, and thanks for the interesting questions.
Well, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, all that talk of food, Stephen, it made me think of that time we went to Ole and Steen. I think it's Ole and Steen. It might be Ollie and Steen. Danish cafe. And we had cinnamon buns that were vegan. And, for all our listeners, I recommend them. They were really nice. But what did you make of the conversation, Stephen?
Yeah, I really think we should consider a side podcast in trying out different cinnamon buns and vegan cinnamon buns. Yeah, they were really good. Anyway, sorry. I really enjoyed that conversation with Kadri. One thing which crossed my mind was how, one of the nice things I think about what Kadri was saying is how veganism potentially offers a different way of being a man, right? Or opening up and challenging some of the dominant ideas about masculinity, which extend far beyond food and affect all areas of one's life, and perhaps provide a positive way of men, embracing more caring, sustainable, healthy, happy ways of being, right? I think that's really quite a a nice thing, which seems to have happened with a lot of the men that she spoke to in her research. But I suppose, yeah, perhaps we should also be wary of romanticizing these things too much, or losing that kind of critical lens, because I think we can see as well that, you know, veganism doesn't necessarily come with gender equality or a loss of kind of patriarchal. I think in some ways it does challenge some of these patriarchal ideas in society, but it doesn't have to, I guess, does it? Because I mean, as Kadri herself said, you know, we do see that some vegan men might kind of advocate for that on the basis of quite traditionally masculine ideas about being strong, being rational, being very, you know, physically fit. I think you can see as well that perhaps some food companies, you know, as we see more food companies getting on the kind of vegan bandwagon as it becomes increasingly popular, perhaps they're recognizing that there is this gap there in the market, you know, that there aren't as many men eating plant-based foods currently. And so they're trying to, you know, lure them in with quite macho advertising sometimes, right? Like, you know, real men eat tofu, or, you know, things like that, or yeah, trying to make the case that actually you can be strong whilst being vegan. Yeah, so perhaps veganism doesn't necessarily challenge some of these ideas about masculinity, even though I think often it does, doesn't it?
Well, I just wanted just to add to what you were saying there. What do you think about the whole sort of identity of being a vegan? Because that you know, it seems like there's potentially a bit of a package there. You know, it's okay, for some men, some people, it's just an aspect of their lifestyle. But as Kadri was saying, it can go well beyond that to be sort of basis for collective action and so on and so forth. And in some ways, I mean, you know, I'm talking to someone who regards himself as vegetarian for probably 40 years with very occasional lapses. But I find the sort of going the whole hog. Oh God, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Going the whole hog to veganism. Slightly tricky, you know. It's a bit absolutist for me personally, you know. And I understand the sort of vegan society definition of minimizing harm to animals. Clearly, that's important, but abolishing harm seems to me to be something, you know, that's a bit. I mean, if it was possible, fine, but I don't think it is possible. You know, for myself anyway. So what do you think your relationship would be with the notion, the identity of being vegan?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd definitely like to become vegan. That's definitely an aspiration I've got. Because I do think that the meat and dairy industries are just causing such huge harm, really, aren't they? Both to other animals, but also to our environment, for all the reasons that Kadri discussed. But it is a challenge, isn't it? And I think maybe different approaches will work better with different people, right? So perhaps for some people, that shift in identity could be very appealing and powerful. But for other people, it might feel quite scary or intimidating, or a kind of step too far for them. And I guess ultimately, you know, these problems we're facing are so urgent that anything we can do to reduce people's consumption of meat and dairy, the better, right? In terms of helping us to tackle climate change and reduce the harm that is caused to other animals. So yeah, perhaps we want to aim to encourage as many as people as possible to embrace veganism, but also just reducing the meat and dairy that we all consume would already be a really important step forward, wouldn't it?
Well, I also was thinking whilst Kadri was talking about George Monbiot's work. You know, George is an environmentalist, long-standing journalist, and he's written quite a bit about this sort of area. And I remember seeing a documentary, a TV documentary that he did, which I think was about food farming methods and relationship with animals and so on. And at one point in that film, he takes it upon himself to go out with a ranger and actually kill a deer. On the basis that deer have been, you know, overgrazing much of the countryside, particularly in Scotland, but other areas of the UK as well. And there's actually too many of them. And, you know, he was traumatized by feeling that he should do this. And so I think that there are some contradictions in there. What do we do about, you know, things like overgrazing or, you know, a surfeit of particular kinds of animals? How does that fit with veganism, I suppose? So I wondered about that. And there was a couple of other things that weren't mentioned, which I thought were interesting as well. One was about animals being used for sport and entertainment, and we have discussions here about the Grand National, well, activism against the Grand National, famous horse race, but also vivisection arguments as well. So that's another aspect of it, which I don't think was talked about. And final thought was on the pandemic. And of course, there is the possibility that the next pandemic, and we can expect that there's going to be one or several, will be zoonotic in origin, will be about transmission from animals to humans, and we're very, very close to a pandemic with H5N1 bird flu. So your point about workers in the industry, that sort of hit home for me as well. I thought that's very, very important, so we need to think about these dimensions too. So that's it. What about you? Any other points?
Yeah, well, I guess just what you said about George Monbiot, I suppose there is an argument there as well, isn't there, that perhaps we shouldn't eat anything that we wouldn't be prepared to kill ourselves, really, right? And it makes me think about, why is it that we as humans think we do have the right to kind of use and exploit and kill other animals for our own benefit? So I can't help but think again about Carol Adams in the links she makes between the ways in which we as humans subordinate other animals and the ways in which women are subordinated in our society. For example, in terms of how they can both be reduced to being objects, to being body parts, and how that can help to legitimize violence against them, really. So I was thinking about, what you said about the whole hog, for example, right? I think that's a good example of how quite violent language about animals and the kind of celebration of violence towards animals is very ingrained in our language, isn't it? And Carol Adams talks about this idea of the absent referent, right? So even when we're talking about things like meat eating, we often kind of try to hide the fact that we are actually talking about the killing and suffering of other animals, other living beings. Yeah, and it's also, I think all of the things you said are so gendered as well, aren't they? And I was thinking about hunting as another good example of this is something which is a very masculinized practice. But there's so many different issues to explore, so we'll have to do more podcasts on this. For now, thank you so much for listening.
Yep, thank you very much, and speak to you soon.
Yeah, and as always, do email us at nowmen@gmail.com if you have any questions or comments. Do subscribe to Now Men if you haven't already, wherever you get your podcasts, and please share it with your friends, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you.